Poor David. He just can't seem to catch a break. It was a pretty bad winter this year. Aside from the generators needing to pick up a few times, the hospital came to work one morning and found the hot water off. This caused quite a lot of problems, as you can imagine, since patients like to take hot showers and doctors like to wash their hands in water scalding enough to make their skin blister. David was called in to fix the problem, since his counterpart was in bed with the flu. David had just gotten home, just started getting ready for bed, in fact, but he put his overalls back on and came to see if he could fix the problem. What he found was the last thing he expected. He told me all this as he sat at the desk and drank hot chocolate with both hands. He had to hold the cup in two hands because they were shaking so badly. David's been doing this job since before I got here. He's no stranger to the oddities that happen in this hospital. Even so, he said this was probably one of the hardest things he's ever seen. I've never seen anything like this during the day. Some weird stuff goes on around here. You know that as much as anybody. But it usually happens at night. The weird stuff happening during the day, that's new. The idea that it could happen at any time really weirds me out. He had started to ramble a bit, not really making much sense, and I asked him if he felt comfortable talking about it. He said he wouldn't have come to talk to me if he didn't, and leaned right into the story about the boiler man. This place is old, you know that much, but I don't think you know how old some of this place is. There are parts of this place that were built in the 70s, but there are other parts that go back all the way to the 30s. I started this job in '93, probably just about the time you stopped crapping in your diapers. And I remember when the undercellar had these big boilers. They used to heat the whole hospital. They were ancient when I got here, and they changed them out about 5 years after I started. They were constantly going out. They were unreliable as all get out, and I was glad to see them go. Not just because they needed constant work, but because of the way I always felt when I was in that basement. I've seen some spooky places around here, but that basement is one of the spookiest. Sometimes you'd be working down there, working on the water heater, or the boiler, or the furnace, and it would sound like somebody dropped a pipe. The basement under the hospital's huge, but you could hear someone drop a pipe down there from a long way back. Other times it sounded like somebody yelling, somebody really screaming down there. But when you went to look, there was nobody there. I asked some of the other guys about it, and they all told me that it sounded like I'd run into the boiler man. I asked them who the boiler man was. They all started grinning and asked how I hadn't heard about the boiler man yet. I was just a kid, a little younger than you actually, and when I said I never heard of him, they told me the whole story. Sometime back in the 30s or 40s, there was a maintenance guy who was responsible for the boilers and the furnaces down there. The hospital was a little smaller then, but it still needed heat and hot water to operate. So that was this fella's whole job. Day in, day out, all he did was work in the basement and mind the boilers and the furnaces. Got to the point that he got to be kind of a hospital spook, and some people claim that he never left at all. Some of the other maintenance guys said he had a cot down there, and he just slept down there next to the boilers and kept the place running all day and night. Well, he did, till the place took care of him in the worst way possible. They say that one winter there was a terrible noise from the basement. People went to the stairwell that led down, and all you could see was smoke and steam boiling up out of the guts of the place. The other maintenance guys went down there to see what had happened, and they found that one of the boilers had fallen over and taken out the one next to it. They had taken out 3 boilers and a furnace, to be specific, before the wall had stopped its destructive rampage. The more they looked, though, the more they realized that that wasn't all it had taken out. As they looked for the boiler man, they started getting nervous when they couldn't find him. Had he been down there when the whole place blew? Had he taken the day off, maybe? As the emergency crews started clearing stuff away, they found the poor guy smashed between two boilers. He'd been trying to stop it from falling, and they had returned the favor by smashing him flat. He was burned almost beyond recognition, and they found that some of the rumors about him had been true. There was a little alcove with a cot and a bookcase, a little hot plate, and some food for his dinner. He'd been living down in the basement, and it appeared that it had been the death of him. That was the way I heard it, at least. And any time there was a weird noise down in the basement, the other maintenance guys just said, "It must be the boiler man." I'd never really believed in him, not right on top. I've seen enough weird stuff in this hospital to make me not question too much of the other spooky stuff that happens. That being said, I'd never seen any evidence of the boiler man in the almost 30 years I've been here. I've seen the ghost girl. I've heard enough people talk about Shaky Leg Mary that I have to believe it. I've checked the phones up on the 3rd floor for your buddy Mark enough times to know that something's going on up there. But the boiler man, that was never something I put a lot of stock into. At least, till this morning. So the new boilers are all on a switch. They're like Christmas lights. If one of them goes out, they all goes out. It's an interesting system, and it'd be a pain in the ass if it weren't for the fact that the computer that's down there can pinpoint exactly which one is messing up the system. It doesn't happen very often. They've got that system pretty tight, but there's about 15 of them down there, and 2 of them were the culprits this morning. So, I took my toolbox, checked the computer, and pinpointed the 2 that were giving us trouble. I got to work on the first one, and it wasn't a real hard fix. Some rats probably got into the wiring. They usually look for somewhere warm to sleep when it's cold, so I started fixing the wires so I could get home and get some sleep before I gotta come back tonight. I'm working on the circuit when suddenly I hear something hit the ground towards the back of the basement. It was like a big metal pipe being dropped, real loud. It rattled all through the basement, and I jumped about a foot and hit my head on the underside of the boiler. I probably taught the boiler man some new words that day, but the bastard had it coming. I listened real close, trying to figure out what the noise was, but after a few minutes I just chalked it up to rats and got back to work. I've almost got it hooked up and ready to flip back on when I hear another pipe hit the ground. This one's a lot closer, maybe next row over, and I holler out to make sure somebody's not down there playing games. I would've thought maybe it was the daytime maintenance guy, Lou. He's a bit of a trickster, but I heard the way he was snorting when I called him on the phone, and I know he's laid up in bed with the flu. I got up and looked around with my flashlight a little, but I couldn't see anybody. It was just me and a lot of quiet old machinery. I closed up the boiler and went to check the computer. Wouldn't you know it, I only had one left to go. I turned back to find the next one, and that's when the lights went out. That ain't really nothing new. You'd be surprised how often the lights go out in the basement. I figured it was the same problem that probably tripped those boilers, and just kinda got back to work. I took my flashlight out so I could see to work, and expected that the power would come back on about the time I got done. If there's one thing you can count on down here, it's that the power's gonna come back on at the least opportune time. So, I set to work on the next one, and God almighty, is this thing screwed up. If it was rats, they had really been at this one. But I kinda doubted that vermin had anything to do with it. It looked like someone had been trying to take it apart. The front panels were off, and some of the fuses and wires were sitting on the floor. The whole thing was a took-apart mess, and as I started putting it back together, I got that feeling I always got when I worked down here. The feeling of being watched. That feeling of something on the ceiling looking down at me. I looked up a few times, shining my flashlight around as I tried to find the source of it. I didn't see nothing, but as I worked, I became aware of a weird shuffling noise. Like I told you, there are definitely rats down in the basement, but this sounded different than that. This sounded more like footsteps. Sounded like when you were a kid wearing flip-flops and your dad told you to pick your damn feet up. Sounded for all the world like somebody dragging their feet along the ground, and I looked up more than once to see if somebody else was down here. I called out, even got up and walked around the basement to see if I could see anybody, and the lack of anybody to be seen was making my skin crawl. It took me about 2 hours of working in the dark down there, but I finally got it back together. I walked over to the computer, not really expecting it to work, what with the power out, but found that it was still up and running. It told me that everything was operational again, and I turned to leave when I heard the most gut-wrenching scream I'd ever heard. It was like listening to a deer that's gotten caught on a fence. The kind of scream you know is going to lead you to find something that's been gutted. I should have left. I should have left right then and got security, but I had to prove that I was still a tough guy. The boiler room was my domain, and I wasn't about to let some weirdo roll around down there unchallenged. I picked up a wrench from my toolbox, taking a ball-peen hammer in the other hand for good measure. Then I made my way out to see if I could find the source of the noise. As I walked between the furnaces and the boilers, their little pilot lights winking in the gloom, I held the wrench out to defend myself if someone should jump out at me. I didn't expect that they would. I'd searched around down here a few times and found nothing. In my mind, I was just being paranoid. There was nothing down here. It was all just stories that I felt I was too old to believe in anymore. There was no boiler man, no spooks down here to jump out and scare me. And soon, I'd go back upstairs and go to bed and not think about any of it till the next time I had to come down here. When the thing shambled out between two boilers, I thought for sure I was having a hallucination. It looked like one of those things in a Romero movie. Its skin was burnt and broken. Its head was hairless and scabby. Its eyes were white and sightless as they stared off and did nothing. When it turned its head to regard me, I could see that its mouth was open and full of broken teeth. It was wearing the tatters of a uniform, and I could see that it was the same one I'd worn when I first started. There was a name stitched over the breast on the left side, but it was charred. I could barely make it out. When it screamed at me, I turned and ran as the wrench hit the ground. He chased me through that murky blackness for what felt like hours. Being stuck in the stairwell was the worst experience of my life, but this was a close second. I could hear it right behind me, its bare feet slapping at the concrete, and the longer I ran, the more sure I felt that it would get me. No matter how many turns I took amidst all those boilers and water heaters, I never seemed to find the door. It was tireless in its pursuit, and as I ran, I seemed to be looking for the hole that I would trip in. I've seen enough horror movies to know that there's always a hole or a pipe or something to trip on so that the monster can eat you up. Thankfully, it never came. As I rounded a set of units, I saw the stairs in the beam of my flashlight. I almost couldn't believe they were real, and as I tripped my way up them, I could swear the creature was still right on my heels. My feet clanked harshly on the metal steps, shaking the edifice as I climbed it, and when I got to the top, I pushed through the door and turned to slam it behind me. He was 2 or 3 steps back, his feet leaving little red splotches on the grates, and when I slammed the door, he shrieked in fury. I'll remember that hellish chase for the rest of my life, and I know it'll follow me whenever I close my eyes. David was still shaking as he finished telling his story, and I felt sorry for him as I finished up my notes. It really seemed like this place had it in for him. I've been working at this hospital for 29 years. 30 in October, but this is the strangest it's ever been. I don't feel welcome here no more, kid. And I think when the board brings up retirement again this year, I might just take him up on it. I'm getting too old for this shit, and I don't think I have another chase like that left in me. He left shortly thereafter, and I asked Carl about it. He just shook his head. The story he told the cops was that a homeless guy had gotten into the basement and must have escaped before they got there. I stuck by it, but I saw the footprints on the stairs. I'm not sure Custodial will ever manage to get them off, and I know Dave will lose it next time he has to go down there and seize them. I got back to work, but I silently thought that retirement might be the best thing for David. Would that we all got to escape the hospital that easily. When David came stumbling towards the desk at about 5:30 one morning, he looked like a man who'd just come back from war. I picked up the phone and called Carl immediately, telling him to get here on the run. I wouldn't usually call security for someone I knew just wandering up. Still, despite David looking like he'd seen a ghost, there was another very crucial reason I notified Carl of the terrified-looking maintenance man who had just staggered up and leaned against my desk. Carl would want to know, especially after what had been going on for the last 3 days. David had been missing after failing to clock out one morning. When Carl had come in the next night and told me that David was missing, I immediately felt bad about how I'd treated him the last time we'd spoken. David had been losing things lately. Last week alone, he lost 2 wrenches, a drywall saw, a tool bag, and an 8-foot ladder. The ladder seemed to almost offend him, and he complained bitterly about it for several days. He had also started talking about that damn stairwell again, the one he claimed made things disappear sometimes. They always appeared on the roof again, or so he said, and he went on and on about it until I just couldn't take it anymore. One early morning, after a night of checking in complainers and listening to whiners, I finally told him that it was probably under the stairs somewhere and he should probably go look for it instead of bothering me. He walked off in a huff, and I didn't see him again until he staggered up to my desk just before quitting time. As Carl ran up, puffing like a bellows, I heard David whisper, "It was the stairs. I climbed and climbed, but they just never ended." I waited with him until the stretcher rolled away, and he groaned as they trundled him past the stairwell and into the ER. I learned through the grapevine that he had been suffering from dehydration and exhaustion. They said it looked like he'd been walking for days, and his feet were covered in blisters. Management kept him isolated for the first 5 days, and I tried to visit him every day. On the 6th day, they finally let me in, and I heard how he had spent the last 3 days on the stairs. He was watching TV when I arrived, and my first act was to apologize for being so short with him. "It's nothing," David assured me. "I let all the loss go to my mouth. Turns out, I should have just let it go," David said, getting a faraway look about him. Even after 5 days of rest, David still looked haggard. "It would have saved me being stuck on that damn stairwell for 3 days. I didn't ask for an explanation. The man had been through enough. It was true that I wanted to hear the story of his disappearance, but after that look, I couldn't bring myself to pry. That look was the same I'd seen on men that had been through natural disasters. Turned out, I didn't have to ask, though. David wanted to talk about it. "I had gone to check the stairwell, see if maybe I'd left it on the upper landing," he said, stuttering as he recalled the events. When the door slammed shut behind me, I knew something didn't sound right." He was trying to keep a smile on his face, but it looked ghastly for the effort. "But I went up the stairs anyway, never knowing what I was getting into." The door had slammed with a note of finality, and David had felt himself shudder as it rang out behind him. David hadn't been that scared in a long time, but he'd be damned if he could say why. He'd felt, for a moment, like a goose had walked over his grave, and he wanted nothing so much as to run back to the door and push it open again. Instead, he mounted the stairs and climbed the 30 steps to the first landing. David had made this trip 1,000 times, and it seemed comfortable to hear his boots clump, clump, clump up the polished concrete steps. He knew all of them, all 150 stairs over the 5 floors of the hospital, and he would have said that there was nothing new or strange about them. He made it to the second landing and looked around as though he expected the missing items to have materialized from nothing. He still saw no ladder or any of his tools and was about to climb to the next floor when he noticed that the number card was missing from the second floor landing. He made a mental note to get a new one from the workshop and headed up to the 3rd floor. People stole them from time to time, mostly kids, and David was pretty used to replacing them. However, David felt his anger bubbling up when he got to the third-floor landing and noticed that the number was gone there, too. David ground his teeth together, finding nothing but more work. Some group of bored kids had come by and stolen his signs, and now he had to get them replaced before management noticed. It would be hard to hang it without a ladder, but he would manage somehow. Thankfully, they hadn't stolen his power drill, so he wouldn't have to work too hard to get them hung again. He climbed to the next floor, and his blistering curses echoed down the stairs behind him. They had stolen this one too. What the hell was going on? When he found the same missing sign on the 5th floor, David decided to give up on this little errand. To hell with his ladder. He apparently had work to do. David had descended back down to what he thought was the 1st floor when he noticed that the door was locked. The stairwell door was never supposed to be locked. It was the building's escape route in case of a fire. As David tried to open the door, he shouted and slammed his shoulder against it. He peeked through the little window set into the door, but the image on the other side just didn't look right. The world beyond was nothing like what he'd expected. It looked like the hospital he'd known, but it was covered in a swirl of smog or smoke or something, and David had feared that there might actually be a fire in progress. He picked up his radio and tried to call for help, but the squall from the other side made him pull away quickly. David began to wonder what sort of things were going on, and whether he might be in over his head. He decided to climb to the 2nd floor and try the door, but the 2nd floor was much the same. David was terrified by this point. He didn't understand. If it was a fire, people should be on the stairs, fleeing the building. There should be no reason for the doors not to open. They had no locks to speak of in the first place. There was a key lock that could be engaged if you were painting or there was an emergency on the stairs, but only David and Hector, the day shift supervisor, had keys to that lock. David began to run up the stairs, 2 at a time, trying every door he came to and finding them all locked and inaccessible. At the 5th floor, David comforted himself with the idea that he could just go up to the roof and try to get someone's attention, maybe even climb down the side of the building. When the stairwell led to another floor with another identical door and another set of steps ascending upward, David really began to panic. He rushed up the stairs, his mind trying to make sense of what he was seeing. He climbed and climbed, sure that any minute he would see the access door to the roof, sure that he would realize that this had all been some sort of fever dream. But no matter how high he climbed or how fast he ran, he never reached the top of the stairs. David was nearly hyperventilating when he finally sat down and put his back against the wall. It didn't make any sense. The stairs were only 5 stories tall. David walked every step at least 5 times a day. The roof was where he went to smoke, since the admins wouldn't let him do it out in front of the hospital anymore. How many times a day did he go up to the roof to have a cigarette? 5? 10? When the ladder and tools had gone missing, he could have overlooked that as some kind of mistake. This, however, was an affront to his very senses. As David leaned against the wall, the unopened door sitting across from him with its hazy window, he was in for another shock. He was digging in his fanny pack, something he kept snacks in just in case he had a low blood sugar spell. As he peeled the wrapper off the granola bar, he became aware of a prickling on his skin. He could see a strange shadow from the corner of his eye, and looked over to the small window that showed him the strange hospital floor beyond the barrier. At first, he thought maybe the lights had gone out over there, but the more his eyes searched, the more he realized that something was blocking out the light that came woozily through the rectangle. Its skin was mottled purple. Its eyes were large and round, filled with little floating spots of blood. Its teeth were fixed in a monstrous, predatory grin. Those spotty eyes were fixed on David, and its regard was something that made his skin crawl. For just a moment, David thought it was screaming at him. When he lunged off the wall and began to run up the stairs, he realized he was the one who was screaming. David couldn't have said how many stairs he ran up, couldn't begin to say how long his panic had caused him to run in a terrified flight, but he was soon pelting upwards at a breakneck speed. When he finally collapsed, the concrete scraping his cheek as he fell, his lungs burned and pumped with the effort to keep up with his galloping heart. He might have been laying there for minutes, days, even just seconds, but when he felt the weight of those terrible eyes looking at him again, David turned his head and saw that a new creature was staring through the little window. It looked like a bat that had fallen into a pincushion, and its skin rippled with sharp spines, even as its two intelligent eyes stared at him through the glass. He wanted to scream. He wanted to run, but his legs would not support him. He lay there transfixed by the sight of this terrible creature as it stared at him. What were its intentions? Could, and the thought scared him more than the sight of the creature, this thing get through the door? It seemed content to stare at him like a visitor in a zoo, but what if its curiosity, or even its hunger, got the better of it? David had thought that his energy was spent. When the overhead light went out, though, leaving him in total darkness save for the thin sliver that came through the rectangular window, he found that his terror and adrenaline gave him a little bit more. He screamed again, the scream tearing out of him like a wound, and he ran towards the light he saw on the landing above him. He kept climbing, seeing the lights disappear below him, and as the darkness chased him up the stairs, David felt he was on the verge of madness. He had to stay in the light. Something told him that it would be very bad if he didn't, and he believed it. When he fell, his foot fumbling on the edge of the step, he screamed as he tumbled back into the blackness. The concrete stairs scraped him up, cutting his skin and rubbing him raw. He fell into the darkness, rolling backwards as momentum took him down onto the landing with the door that would not open. The light spilled across him, making him look like an actor at the end of a play. The light was bright but murky, and it became murkier still as the creatures gathered around the window to look at him. David's head hurt. He had clearly hit it on the way down. As he lay there in that deepening darkness, he almost wished that they would come in and get him. His body was a mass of pain, and his sanity felt like a ball of yarn after a kitten's been at it. As he lay there and contemplated his death, David felt himself slipping off into unconsciousness. He didn't know if he'd ever wake up again, and at that moment, he didn't really care. The next thing I knew, I was coming to on the first floor landing and everything was back to normal, David said. I listened to David's story, my breath catching several times, unsure of what to make of it. In the 3 days he had been missing, 100 people had been up and down those stairs. None of them had reported seeing David. None of them had reported being trapped in the stairwell, and the thought that people had climbed the stairs where David had ran in a blind panic was somehow even more terrifying. Someone on day shift maintenance found his missing ladder and tools in the basement the day before David was to be released. The tools were neatly placed under the ladder, which was folded up and leaned against the boiler. Management assumed that David had misplaced it, but David swore that he hadn't been in the basement for months. Not since I had to check the hot water heater after the pilot light went out, he said, his voice unsure. No one could explain where David had been or what had happened to him, but they all agreed that David would likely be fired if it ever happened again. David doesn't go into the stairwell anymore, not unless he has someone with him. Carl goes with him sometimes if he has to use the stairs, and I've come with him a few times if I was on break or something. Otherwise, David takes the elevator. He's lost his liking for those 150 stairs now, and I can't say as I blame him. It did stop him from smoking, so I guess there was that. The elevator would only go up to the 5th floor, and since no one he knew smoked, David gave up the habit. I guess his smoking was a small price to pay for never having to experience that again. There are places in this old hospital that seem to border on places better left alone. These places seem to hunger for us, to draw us to them, and those who enter are rarely the same again.
I was having lunch with Mark when an unfamiliar face came to sit with us. He wore a lab coat, gray scrubs, and a badge identifying him as morgue staff. Mark extended his fist for the newcomer to bump and made introductions as I covertly slid my salad back a little bit. He looked clean, but God knew what was on that lab coat. This is John. He works in the sub-basement. He was telling me about a spooky time in the morgue the other night. I told him he ought to come tell you about it, since we know you collect spooky stories. I looked at John, telling him to go on and tell it, and he steepled his fingers and grinned knowingly. It's a weird one, but I suspect you've heard more than one weird story here. This place is an odd epicenter of strangeness, and more than one person has told me that strange things just happen here sometimes. I told him to quit stalling, but I said it kindly. It happened a couple of nights ago, while I was staying late to file some paperwork. John pushed the body back and closed the door. the cold air making him shiver as it whooshed out. Updating his paperwork. John was staying late to finish up a report on an important autopsy they had done earlier that day, and it was vital that he got it done by tonight. As he sat writing, making notes on the body chart, he heard the strange tapping for the first time. He looked up from his report, thinking it was the pipes in the sub-basement. They were notoriously dodgy when it came to stability, the 6-story gargantuan having been built on top of it, one floor at a time. The immense pressure that hung over his head would have driven a normal person insane, but to John it was just another day in the tombs. When you worked around death, it was hard to think about one's imminent crushing. John went back to his work, scribbling notes about wounds they had found and the condition of the organs beneath. The body had been the victim of a rather nasty gang hit. Unfortunately for both the man and the gang that had killed him, he was an undercover cop trying to get information for an arrest. The cops sent the body to Cashmere General in the hopes that the gang wouldn't find out they'd been identified, but John didn't figure there was much of a chance of that. The gangs were better connected than the police, and he was sure that they were already scrambling to find out exactly what they had found. John looked up as the tapping came again, his scritching pen stalling as he listened for the source. It sounded like someone was tapping their fingers on the door to the morgue, a large metal roll door that opened sideways and took up a large part of the far wall. It was 3 taps, each about 3 seconds apart, and it would scamper across his ears roughly every 20 seconds or so. The morgue was a big open room with metal tables and wall freezers, so the sound was hard to pinpoint with any real accuracy. The fact that the room was mostly a concrete box didn't help matters either, and the longer he listened, the more John was certain that someone was tapping on the roll door. He got up and walked across the long, cold stretch of tile, checking his watch as his booties scuffed the familiar distance. It was 10:30 at night. There shouldn't be anyone in the sub-basement after 9. Hell, he shouldn't even be down here. But the workload demanded it, and there was only a little more to be done, perhaps an hour at the most. But it would require him to get done with his notes and seal them in the envelope Detective Moore had been nice enough to include. He hoped for a fleeting moment that Rebecca might have stopped by for a visit. They had made plans to hang out that night, but had to reschedule when this case had been dumped in his lap. He almost expected to see her there as he slid the door open, her or maybe some harried ambulance driver with a late-night delivery, but as the door creaked open, he found only the empty hallway. He looked up and down the dingy little space, the elevator sitting placidly with its doors closed, and the double metal grate that led up to the street sitting equally as unused. John cocked his head, listening for the knocking, but it appeared to have stopped for the moment. Sliding the doors closed, he returned to his seat and got back to work. Maybe, if he got done soon, he could text Rebecca and she would still want to hang out with him at his place, he thought as he sucked on the end of his pen and thought less than scholarly thoughts. When the tapping suddenly scurried across his ears again, he was shaken from his warm daydream and brought back to reality. What the hell was that? Was it mice? They did sometimes get vermin down here, but it was rare. Ever since they had fired Dumphy, the rats had gone down without him to leave chips and food out to attract them. Besides, rat skitters were different, John reminded himself. It could still be the pipes, but that was usually more of a liquid sound. No, the longer John listened to it, the more it sounded like fingers drumming on metal. He kept looking, his mind racing as he tried to find the source of the tapping, and that was when his eyes settled on the rows and rows of cooler doors. There were 20 in all, long drawers capable of holding a single body in each, and as he watched them, he heard the tap-tip-tap of fingers inside one of the drawers. John felt a chill creep up his spine as he tried to put the idea out of his head. There was nothing in that cabinet that could be tapping, none of them hiding anything particularly lively. He currently had 8 bodies, one of them the diced-up body of the undercover cop he'd been working on, but none of them could have been the source of the tippy-tapping. John didn't want to check out that tapping, but what if something was in one of those cabinets? What if there was a rat in one of them? John had seen 1 or 2, the big kind that often came out of the sewers. If a big fat wharf rat was in there nibbling on a corpse, John would find himself out on his ass, just like poor old Dumphy. The body freezers were 4 coolers high and 5 coolers long. The 5 on top, all currently full. The 3 below the middle drawer were full, and it made a crude sort of T. As John stood trembling before the coolers, he heard those 3 hollow taps again. Nothing in there could make that noise, but he heard it plain as day. Tip, tap, tip. The sound of fingers tapping on the metal door. His hands trembled as he reached for the handle in the 3rd freezer, the puff of air making goosebumps pop up on his arm as he opened the door to peek inside. A blonde woman about 25, nude with an X-shaped wound on her chest that had been stapled up, greeted him mutely. John closed the cooler, but heard the tap again, this time from the 1st freezer in the row. He reached for the handle, hearing the tap, tip, tap, as his hand shuddered before wrapping around the cold metal. He opened it slowly, fearing his knocking knees would join the tapping, but inside was a very still old man with knees that wouldn't quite lay down. He was naked too, his chest equally stapled, and when John closed the freezer door, he heard that tip-tap-tip again. He glanced down to the far side, the 4th in line this time, and closed the door to the old man's chute as he walked away. The tap-tip-tap seemed louder now, more clattery than hard, and John was starting to think about running away. Did he really want to know what was making that sound so badly? He could just take his papers up to the cafeteria, a place that would be half dark and very quiet now. He could escape the tip-tap-tip, or whatever was banging on the drawer. But John needed to know. He reached for the handle while his nerves still held, and wrenched it open quickly. Inside, amidst the cold smoke, was the body of Officer Clive Daniels, his naked form looking like a dartboard. He lay placidly enough upon his slab, but John did a double-take as he looked at his face. He thought for a moment that someone had put a mask over Clive's face, the white standing out against his black skin, but as it fluttered feebly, John realized what it was. It was a moth, one of the largest he had ever seen. It lay perfectly over his face, so that the markings of his wings looked like huge, staring eyes. Clive appeared to be looking at the roof of the chute with amazement, and as John reached out to lift the moth off him, it flapped feebly again. This had clearly been what he had heard. The moth had been stuck inside when he closed Clive back in, and he'd been bumping against the door, hoping to get out of the cold. It lay in John's hand, taking up both palms. John turned back to his desk, but was suddenly overcome with a strange urge. Holding the moth in his left hand, he reached out with his right and tapped the inside of the door. Tonk, tonk, tonk. It didn't sound like the sound he had heard, or the sound he would have heard from the fingers of Mr. Daniels, were he to reach out and knock. The sound he had heard was higher, more clattery, like bones. The moth took flight then, flapping across the space, and John turned to watch. It was surreal, like something in a dream, and John suddenly wondered if he had fallen asleep at his desk. As he watched the moth waft towards the door, John was momentarily transfixed, turning away from the cold breeze billowing from the chute, and if he hadn't turned, he would have lost his fingers to the swinging door. It slammed shut as he watched the moth, making him jump like a scalded cat. That tapping was back, 100-fold. It tapped, tip, tap, tip, over and over again, and John could hear it coming from all the doors. It rattled the freezers, shaking the handles as the tapping became faster and faster. The doors jounced and bucked, threatening to break open and spill their angry contents across the office. It wasn't just the 8 cabinets that were occupied either. All 20 cabinets were shaking and bucking as John watched them fearfully. When he bumped against the long tables they used for autopsies, John became aware that he'd been backing up. He heard it rattle as he shook, the fear overwhelming him, and when he ran, he almost forgot to close the door behind him. He slammed it shut, running the lock as he heard the rattling cabinets clamoring behind him. He left the report on the table and didn't stop fleeing until he was safely in his car. He'd seen enough to make him promise never to be alone in the morgue at night again. I'd just finished the last bite of my salad, my mouth dry as I heard about the rattling morgue cabinets. Bet your boss was pretty mad when he found out you hadn't finished that report. John nodded, grinning ruefully. He was, until I told him what had happened. He softened a little, showing me the folder with the report in it that he had finished. I should have told you that might happen, but it's usually better to let people see it for themselves. It's the reason that no one stays past dark down there. I didn't have to add much to complete it, but next time, make sure you don't dilly-dally. It's a little more lively after dark than most people might believe. He got up then, saying he needed to get back to work. Mark nodded. Interesting enough for you? I nodded back. Very. Thanks, dude. It was only a matter of time before I had my own experience, I guess. You only get to chronicle things like this for so long before they decide to come and say hi. Yesterday they rolled out the welcome wagon in spectacular fashion. It all started with the laziness of the shift before me. I came in around 6 p.m. to start my shift and noticed a large white envelope at the reception desk. I asked Tyler, the guy who works the day shift, how long that had been sitting there. He shrugged and said they had brought it in around noon. When I asked why he hadn't bothered to get it delivered, he said he had been busy. Given the indent in the chair, I doubted he had left the desk all day. He said his goodbyes and headed out, and I sat down to start my own work for the night. I promptly forgot about the envelope until around midnight, when I got a call that started all of this. The second I heard the oh-so-docer tones of head nurse Finley from 5 East, I knew this wouldn't be a fun conversation. Do you have a legal envelope at your desk? Yeah, day shift left it here and never delivered it. And when were you planning to deliver it? I could almost hear her biting the inside of her cheek as she talked to me. My apologies, ma'am. I'm still waiting to receive a break. When someone comes to relieve me for a few minutes, I'll bring it right up there to you. Those papers are critical, and I needed them at the start of my shift, not 6 hours later. Have someone bring them up to me immediately, or I'll be drafting a complaint to your supervisor. That got my attention. My supervisor, Helen, pretty well left the night shift alone. Day shift, however, was almost constantly subjected to her micromanaging. If I gave her a reason to, I'm sure she'd be happy to add me to her list of things to do. So I turned on my best customer service voice and assured the charge nurse that I would have her envelope there within the hour. She hung up on me, and I looked up to see Carl wandering by about that time. Hey, Carl, you got a minute to take this up to 5 East? Sorry, man, Carl said. I'm on a tight schedule tonight. I need to get up to 3 North before 3 o'clock and handle some kind of lock malfunction for them. Okay, well, could you stand here for 5 minutes while I do it? I'll be right up and down. Won't take me more than a couple of minutes. That got Carl's attention. You could tell the poor guy had been running his legs off all night. Hospital security never seemed to stop after 8 o'clock, and the thought of taking it easy for 5 to 10 minutes appealed to him. He nodded, telling me to go ahead as he took a load off, and I grabbed the envelope and headed for the elevators. The elevators in the lobby are brand new. They don't hitch, they don't shake, and they can generally be counted on to take you from the ground floor to the 5th floor, without smelling like burning rubber bands or threatening to drop you to your death. They were installed about 5 years ago with some budget money from the state, and they're a vast improvement on the ones that we had before. Or so I've been told. They're well maintained, too. All the lights work, the handrails are clean, and when you push the buttons, they light up, letting you know exactly where they're taking you. I walked past these and turned down a nearby corridor to find the staff elevators. If you've never worked in a hospital, you might not be aware of this. The administration doesn't like it when staff use the guest elevators. It leads guests to ask them questions. Questions that some of them are more than happy to answer, whether they should or not. It also leads staff to push patients in gurneys onto elevators, which sometimes frightens the guests. This is, of course, gone over very carefully in our yearly training, so we all know not to use the nice new guest elevators. The staff elevators are not as nice. The lights flicker, they smell like they're constantly about to break, and they're notorious for getting stuck between floors. According to maintenance, they hadn't sized the elevator shafts right when they built the 4th and 5th floor. This leads to some problems sometimes,
and Mark says that not a week goes by when he doesn't get at least one call to the switchboard about someone being stuck in the elevators. In fact, he had a hilarious story about a doctor who cried on the emergency phone for close to 3 hours while he was stuck inside one of those elevators. He said the poor guy was talking about things with claws, disembodied laughing, and weird noises coming from inside and outside the elevator. Mark always laughed it off as weird, frightening paranoia, and until today, I'd laughed right along with him. The trip up in the staff elevators was uneventful. The wheels chugged, the lights flickered a little when they passed 3 and 4, but when they dinged drunkenly to let me out on the 5th floor, only a minute and a half had passed. I walked around the corner to 5 North, and it seemed that luck was with me. The charge nurse was just stepping into the back to get a cup of coffee, and I handed the envelope to one of her subordinates as I asked if she would mind passing it off to her. She smiled and said that she would, advising that I get moving before the old battle axe returned and found me here. I climbed happily back into the staff elevator, thinking I had dodged a bullet. When I hit the big red button on the elevator, I thought nothing more exciting than a ride down was about to happen. I had no idea what was in store for me. When the elevator ground to a halt between floor 3 and 4, I loosed a growling cry of rage. In frustration, I smashed at the buttons, but the box did little but click and grind as it stuck tight in the shaft. I was going to have to call Mark so David could come get me unstuck. I picked up the emergency phone inside the little box at the bottom of the button pad and expected to hear it click as it rang in the control room. Instead, it just hung there, silently. I hung it back up and picked it back up again, expecting a delay in the line, but there was still silence. I figured I'd disconnected the line when the elevator got stuck, and when I hung the phone back up, I thought guiltily about how Carl would be a little late for his checks. Without the ability to let anyone know, I could be stuck here for quite some time. I paced around the elevator like a mouse stuck in a shoebox. I hated confined places. I wasn't claustrophobic, but I hated the feeling of being stuck. The little box felt like a coffin the longer I sat in it, and looking at my watch didn't help matters. At some point, it had stopped, and I hadn't noticed. It informed me that only about 4 minutes had passed since I left the desk. But that couldn't be right. I'd been stuck in this elevator longer than that. I tried the phone again, but it was still dead, and I hung it up a little harder than I strictly needed to. As I sat in the corner of the elevator, feeling the cold metal against my back, it sounded like something was tapping against the outside. Well, of course, I could hear tapping, I told myself. The elevator was sitting in a chute, probably trying to get itself to work again. If nothing else, it was ticking as it got comfortable in the slightly too small chute. It sounded different than that, though. This sounded different than the ticking of an elevator getting comfortable, and more like the tapping of fingers on glass. I tried to put it out of my mind, telling myself I was being silly, but as I leaned my head back against the metal box, the tapping became harder and harder to ignore. It was almost rhythmic. 2 beats, 3 beats, 2 beats again, on the outside of the metal box. It reminded me of someone just absent-mindedly tapping on their desk, maybe working out a beat in their head as they put words to it. It had no real rhythm, and the longer I listened to it, the less sure I was that it was normal elevator noise. Was somebody out there? They couldn't be, could they? That was why the elevator got stuck, after all. The space was too small. I'd been thinking too loudly about it, and missed the point where the tapping had stopped. I sat in a pregnant silence for a count of 30, cocking my head as I listened and waited for the tapping to begin again. When the elevator suddenly shook like it had been kicked by a horse, I felt like I might need a new pair of pants when all this was over. I tried to get a hold of myself. It was just maintenance, working on the elevator after all. Someone had noticed that the elevator wasn't working, and they were trying to get it running again. I was sure that David was in the motor room, trying to figure out how much pressure to put on the winch to get the cart to move without ripping it to shreds. He told me one night that it was basically all he could do, just exert a little more force on the winch and hope that he didn't pulp some poor staffer. OSHA would likely have a field day with it, but I'm just doing what maintenance told me to do, he had said. When it lurched again, I breathed a sigh of relief when it started to go down. I grabbed the rails, however, as the feeling of gravity left the car. I was suddenly plummeting down like a comet. The buttons flashed, dinging a hellish chorus as I shook and clung to the wall. As I fell, I watched the numbers tick down until they were finally just spinning in place, indecipherable jargon that meant nothing. When the screeching returned, I no longer had any illusions that it was just the box grinding against the walls. The doors began to rock, and the lights overhead flashed like a funhouse ride. Something began to peel the doors open, its long black claws making the steel slab groan in agony. As it slid open, I could see something huge push its head into the space. It had a face like a dragon, its eyes burning as it stared at me through the gap. Behind it, I could see that I was falling through a red and black hellscape. The skies cried fire as the ground came up to swallow me, but I didn't think smashing into the earth was the worst outcome in this case. As it opened its mouth, I saw fire kindle in its throat. The bloom of red began to grow, and I could feel the heat as it built in that small place. I covered my face with my arms, praying for any protection from my frail body that it could grant. Then the cheery ding filled the car, and I was looking at the dim illumination from the staff hallway by night. A woman was stepping in, a cup of coffee in one hand and a phone in the other, and she stopped as she saw me. She looked confused, asking if I was okay, but as the doors began to close, I shot through them like a lunatic and went running from the elevator like the devil himself was chasing me. Carl smiled and commented that I'd only been gone about 5 minutes and must have made pretty good time. His face fell when he got a good look at me, and he turned white as I told him what had happened. Maybe David really did see something in the stairwell, he whispered, and all I could do was nod somberly. I sat there for the rest of my shift, but I didn't get any work done. I haven't slept well in 3 days. My nightmares plagued by the images I saw in that elevator. I've stumbled onto the hospital's radar, and as little as I want to find out what it has in store for me, I'll be back tomorrow night for more. The money's nice, but what I really crave is the tales that come from the lips of the recently terrified. There may be a book somewhere in these stories. My suffering and the suffering of others should be worth something, after all. I met someone new at the hospital tonight. Someone with a very interesting story. Mark came over to watch YouTube videos on his break as I sat behind the reception desk, and he had someone new with him, wearing brown scrubs signaling he was a custodian. Mark said his name was Gerald, and they had struck up a friendship as he cleaned the switchboard office. The two had started talking about spooky stuff. Mark had told him about the calls from the 3rd floor, the phantom phone calls that happened in the wee hours, and Gerald had told him about the strange occurrences he had heard about on the 3rd floor as well. It's not really that scary, but it's pretty weird. I told him I'd love to hear it, and he began. It all started when Maria disappeared. The meeting was just as it was every day. The head custodian giving out assignments, talking about budgets, assigning special teams, before he started down a very different track. He told us the 3rd floor would be cleaned in pairs now, and that no one would be cleaning alone after 8 p.m. There were quite a few raised eyebrows at this. It would take longer to clean if they had to do it in pairs, but the next announcement really got them staring. Management has asked us to remind you that if you hear anyone calling your name from a room you know to be empty, do not respond. Leave the area and inform a member of the custodial team. You will not be disciplined. Management wants to ensure that no one else goes missing on shift. We broke then, going to clean our assigned areas. They were, of course, talking about Maria. Maria had been a custodian at the hospital for several years. She had been working her way through cosmetology school, living with her mother and helping with the bills. Anyone who had worked with Maria knew that she was passionate about her family and her education. She was friendly, but she made it very clear that she didn't have time for boys or needless waste. She worked, she went home, she went to school, and then she repeated the process the next day. She had disappeared one night during her shift, and it was harder to write off as just another young person disappearing with their boyfriend. Staff had been questioned, work schedules had been looked over, Cameras had been watched, and Maria remained unfound. The footage showed that Maria had come to work, clocked in at the scanner box, and gone off to the shift meeting. She had taken her cart up to the 3rd floor and began to clean. She cleaned 3 North, the short stay wing, and moved on to 3 South, the longer residency wing. Many of these rooms were empty. COVID had made long-term stay a matter of quarantine, and those people were housed downstairs in the ER overflow. She had gone to lunch at 7:30 and then returned to her duties. At 9, a camera near the nurse's station had seen her turn suddenly and look into room 405. She had stood as though hearing something inside. The mop she had been putting away looked like it might fall out of her hands, and she let it fall from the cart as she took a step towards the room she'd been staring at. She stepped into the room like a sleepwalker and never stepped back out again. That had been a week ago. The announcement about the voices had come after they'd interviewed a few of her friends. They said that she had been nervous lately. She claimed that she hadn't been sleeping well. She told them that she had dreamed about this place. In the dream, she was cleaning the hallways, and from the doors, she could hear voices calling her name. They told her to come investigate, to come look, to come and see, and just as she would catch sight of the speaker, she would come awake, crying. She couldn't remember what had been in those rooms, but it always filled her with a sense of dread. When she started hearing the voices at work, too, she had asked people to come with her. They said she was afraid to be alone, especially on the 3rd floor, where the voices seemed to follow her. She had stopped sleeping at all, her eyes bearing dark circles, and the last day they had seen her at work, she confided that her studies had suffered as well. She was slowly driving herself crazy with these delusions, one of the other housekeepers had said. I think if it had gone on much longer, she would have probably crashed her car on the way to work one morning. Now Maria had gone, and more than one custodian had refused to clean the 3rd floor, something that was about to become a big problem for me. I was cleaning the 1st floor bathrooms when Roger approached me. "Gerald, I need you to move for a while." I looked up from my mop bucket. "Yeah? Who quit?" "Jan. After I told her she'd have to clean the 3rd floor. I need to move you up there to work with Daryl." "Christ, you sure that's why she quit?" I know, but you know how hard it is to fire anyone around here. Look, I just need you to clean up there for a couple of days, a week tops. I'll even give you a couple of days off, with pay, once we replace Jan. What do you say?" I thought it over. 4-day weekend, 2 of them with pay, and all I had to do was clean with Daryl for a few nights. Yeah, I suppose that would be okay. I had already figured that I would be doing most of the cleaning myself, but that wasn't too bad either. Cleaning was monotonous, but it wasn't terribly hard. Half the rooms I'd have to clean were empty anyway, so it would just be a little light upkeep. What was the worst that could happen, right? I took my cart and headed upstairs. When the elevator doors opened, I could already see a cart waiting in what had been the patient's waiting area, and was now just a corridor with benches in it. I could see soda cans on it, 3 or 4 empties, and about 3 others that were waiting to be sacrificed, and knew just whose it was. Daryl's cart was much like Daryl, messy and unconcerned with it. Daryl had about as much business being a custodian as I had being a pigeon, but Roger had been right. They were desperate for help, and Daryl came to work, even if he didn't do anything. I walked over to 3 North and introduced myself, asking what still needed to be cleaned. The charge nurse sniffed. "Everything to my knowledge. I haven't seen Daryl at all. Not that I'm surprised." I sighed. I had hoped that Jan would have at least cleaned 3 North before quitting, but I suppose that was too much to hope for. I set to work with my mop and my cleaners and started cleaning up behind patients and staff. It took forever. Some of the toilets in the patients' rooms looked like they hadn't been cleaned in years, and when I finally rolled my cart off the wing, it was after 9. I was thinking longingly about my dinner, but decided to finish 3 South so I could eat and start on 3 East when I got done. As expected, 3 South was a ghost town. The nurse's station was empty, the monitors black, and the whole wing was quiet. I wondered which one of these rooms I'd find Daryl asleep in, and shook my head as I set about dusting the nurse's station. The dust wasn't too thick. It was obvious that the station had either been dusted recently, or the wing had been cleared out recently. The break room was also pretty clean. I only had to clean a few moldy food items out of the fridge and change some garbage. The bathrooms needed cleaning. Clearly Daryl didn't do bathrooms, and once the station was clean, it was time to head to the rooms. As I started cleaning, I kept my ears peeled for sounds. Now, I didn't believe in voices from rooms. Ghosts and spooks were totally something I didn't put a lot of stock in. but I did believe in serial killers, or people who kidnap people to sell them into the human trafficking market. Marie had been a very pretty girl, young and well-built, and the thought that someone had somehow taken her from the hospital wasn't terribly far-fetched. If that was the case, and this was a place they usually use to take their prey, I really didn't want to get grabbed or stabbed next. As I cleaned, though, I did start to think I heard something. At first, I wrote it off as the air conditioner, the ancient old thing making noises and trying to rattle the dust motes free of its guts. The more I cleaned, however, the more the air started to sound like words. I ignored it, thinking it was just Daryl playing tricks, if it wasn't my own mind playing tricks on me. I kept cleaning, stepping into the rooms with the open doors, and dusting the beds and the nightstands. I mopped them, checked the bathrooms, and kept the mop at hand in case I had to defend myself. I felt a little sorry for anyone who tried to jump out and scare me, because they were certainly going to get a mop handle upside the head. I was cleaning one of those rooms when I looked up into the big window behind me and stopped in my tracks. The door to the room behind me was open, the room looking much the same as the one I was cleaning, and someone was standing in the doorway. Someone I would have known anywhere. My mother looked exactly the same as I remembered her. Her dark hair, usually up in a bun on her head, fell around her in a long wave of ebony. She was wearing a light white dress, her bare feet poking out from beneath it. She was standing in the doorway, arms spread wide, inviting me to come to her. Her face was serene, restful, exactly the way I remembered her the last time I'd seen her. It was exactly the way she had looked as her casket lid shut and we put her in the ground. I turned around, but she was gone. I put the mop in the bucket and stuck my head out of the room. I called out, seeing if anyone was near. I'd been cleaning for nearly an hour and still hadn't seen Daryl. I wasn't afraid to clean by myself. I wasn't superstitious, didn't believe in spirits, but not seeing anyone was beginning to become nerve-wracking. When no one called out or challenged me, I got back to work. I closed the door to the room I had just been in, but as I wheeled my cart away, I heard a soft voice from the room across from this one. It was low and inviting, and I couldn't help but think of my mom again. The voice was calling to me, begging me to come to her, and I stopped again to look through the door to that room. She was gone, no one inside the room but the shadowy furniture, but it almost seemed like I could feel someone watching me from inside. She was there, and she wanted me to come to her. As I stood dithering in the hall, a multitude of voices called from the doors that stood open farther up. I recognized all of them. They were the voices of lost loved ones, old friends, and others who had passed on. I heard my great-uncle, my first girlfriend, my third-grade English teacher, and so many more. I heard them calling to me, trying to entice me into their room, to entice me from this world, and I felt my feet pulled towards them as they called. I'd have walked willingly into those rooms, but at that moment, an alarm went off, and I was jarred back to reality. Code blue, room 302. Code blue, room 302. I shook myself. Somewhere on 3 North, there would be people with crash carts in full sprint. Somewhere on 3 North, nurses would be pulling charts and calling doctors. Family members might be yelling or crying, praying to God for their loved ones to come out of this crisis. On 3 South, however, there was only me and the multitude of voices. With the last of my resolve, I ran. I cocked an eyebrow at Gerald. What happened after that? I came to talk to Mark about it. I know he's had some weird experiences in this place, and I was hoping he might have some insight. He brought me down here to talk to you. I shrugged. I can talk to Carl. Maybe he'll go up to the 3rd floor with you when you need to clean. Seeing Carl wander by about that time, I called out to him, and he came somberly over to us. I made my request, and Carl agreed, but said he couldn't tonight. 3rd floor is closed for the moment anyway. We're missing a custodian, and a few of us are being sent to search 3 South. After the girl disappeared last week, this will probably get the wing closed off. As it happens, the wing did close. It was temporarily closed, of course. They'll have patients in there again if the need arises. God help us if one of them goes missing. Staff is one thing, but if their precious patients go missing, they might have to actually do something about it. Gerald went back to his usual cleaning route. We still talk sometimes. He's a good guy, and I don't mind having a cup of coffee with him. We guys who have been privy to the strange happenings of the hospital have to stick together, after all.
The doctor
one of the newer plastic surgeons at Cashmere Hospital, looked a little sheepish as he approached my desk. I had only seen him a few times, and he had never spoken to me directly. He was a vain fella, in the same vein as a few of the other hotshot docs around the ER. But today, he looked rattled. His hair was unkempt, his clothes looked dirty, and he was glancing around in that way that made me think he might be followed. "Are you the one who collects the stories?" he asked. I looked around, not sure if he was hiding from someone, before telling him that I was. "Carl said you'd understand. I don't know what happened to me, but he told me that you might be able to help me make sense of it. I know you're at work, but do you have a minute to talk?" It was currently about 10 o'clock, and I was in the middle of a lull in activity. The real work wouldn't be possible until they called for visitors to leave, so I pushed out a chair and pulled out a notepad. I'd started carrying it religiously, the stories becoming habitual, and I wanted to get all the information while it was fresh. His name was Dr. Gary Long, and he'd experienced something that I had only heard about once before. The more he talked, the more I realized that he was talking about the creatures that had taken up residence in the forbidden corridor over the East Wing record mezzanine. I've only been working at Cashmere for a couple of months, but I'd heard all the rumors. Dr. Logan still tells people about what happened to him in the elevator. People talk about the ghost girl in the South Wing that jumps from the 5th-story balcony. And everyone, nurses and doctors alike, know that if you're in the OR too late, you might run into Shaky Leg Mary. I listened, but privately I thought they were nothing but stories. It was just talk. Every hospital has them, but Cashmere Hospital has a bit of a reputation. Even in med school, the students knew about the weirdness that surrounded the hospital, and when my friends heard I'd accepted a job offer there, they joked that I was going to get taken away by a ghost one night. Well, I don't think it was a ghost that tried to get me. Ghosts don't do what this thing did. It was late when I got done with my case. I dressed out and was leaving to get my car from the garage. This sounds silly, but I always park my car at the bottom of the parking lot. It's a 2021 Mercedes that I'm still likely going to be paying for when I'm 40, but doctors are expected to maintain a certain air of affluence. Fancy watches, big houses, shiny cars, it all gives off the illusion of wealth, while most of us are drowning in student loans or credit card debts. The car was a frivolity that I couldn't really afford, but I was trying and mostly succeeding at keeping my head above water. So when I took the elevator down to the 5th-floor basement of the car park and found nothing but empty spots, I was shocked. I had parked it in the 3rd spot on the left side, and now it was gone. There were no other cars down there either, so I could only assume that someone had either stolen it or it had been towed for some reason. I was grumbling when I climbed back into the elevator, but I felt confident that this could be solved in short order. If it had been stolen, then my insurance would get me a rental car and the police would find it. The car was insured for quite a lot, and I had little doubt that the premiums would buy me another one if it had been taken. If the hospital had my car towed, then they would get me a rental car and get the impound lot to bring my damn car back. When the elevator didn't move after I jabbed the buttons, my anger flared. I slapped at the buttons, but nothing happened. I picked up the phone and tried to call the switchboard, but there was no tone. The door didn't close either, which didn't seem weird until I thought about it. They just stayed open, and finally I threw the phone at the bank of lit-up buttons and decided to walk out of the garage and find someone to yell at. It had been a long day, and I was tired, and all this bullcrap was really starting to make me mad. I started walking towards the ramp then, and if I'd known what would happen later, I think I'd have just stayed in the elevator. The next floor up was empty too, and I wondered how late it was before my watch told me it was barely 9. Most of the other employees were probably just lazy and didn't want to drive all the way back up. They didn't care if people dinged their cars, and I figured I would see more cars as I went up. It was comfortable enough down here, the concrete box creating a cave of sorts, and the fluorescents overhead hummed with insectile good cheer. Other than the hum, my footfalls seemed to be the only noise. The constant tock, tock, tock of my sneakers was monotonous, but it was also a little nice to know that I hadn't just gone deaf. There really wasn't any other sound down there, and as I came to the 3rd floor, I was surprised that there still wasn't any windows to the outside. The first 2 levels had been basements, but surely this one should be at ground level, right? This floor was when I started to notice the plants as well. They were palmettos, I think, and they sprouted up from the concrete in places. The fronds looked pokey, and I really didn't want to touch them and find out. I wondered why maintenance or groundskeeping hadn't done something about them, but it was really none of my business. They were in the corners and out of the way, and they weren't hurting anything. The Georgia flora has always been a bit invasive sometimes, and seeing plants in a man-made structure wasn't anything uncommon. That was the first time I felt something watching me, too. I was coming up the ramp and onto the 2nd floor when I heard something scrub against the concrete. It was a low sound, like fingernails, but when I turned, there was nothing there. The concrete parking structure was still empty, and it was becoming odd that I hadn't seen any cars or people. A dozen others, nurses and techs, had been with me in the surgery, and to see neither them or their vehicles here was strange. I was coming to the level just beneath the entrance ramp. Why hadn't I seen anyone yet? As the phantom eyes bored twin holes into my shoulder blades, I picked up the pace. I wanted to be out of here. My anger was beginning to subside as the creeping chill of fear sent icy fingers through it. The next floor should have definitely been at ground level, but it was the same bland box that the others had been. There were no cars, no people, but the plants had gotten thicker. They were looking more like jungle plants now, and the cool cave was becoming a little humid. I saw vines hanging from the ceiling, and they seemed to be coming right out of the concrete. Why hadn't I ever noticed any of this before? Its presence did little to soothe me, and when I heard a crunch from behind me, I quickened my pace. I could still hear that low noise coming from behind me. I wasn't as alone as I thought. It felt like something was stalking me, and as I ran up the next ramp, I almost cried out when it was more of the same. I was running now, my feet carrying me onward as my brain began to scream that we were trapped. The plants were becoming more dense, growing up out of the floor, and the concrete seemed to be giving way to dirt in places. I was running now, my feet carrying me onward as my brain began to scream at me that we were trapped. I stumbled, but I caught myself before I fell and glanced back to make sure that nothing was chasing me. I don't know how, but I knew that if I fell, that would be the end of me. I'd gone higher than the parking deck could possibly be, 5 floors higher than the roof, when the lights suddenly went out. I don't mean that the lights flickered. I don't mean they just sort of dimmed. I mean that suddenly I was something akin to blind. As I stood still in the blackness, I could hear them again. They sounded like animals, walking around on all fours as their claws scraped across the ground. I had thought there was only one of them, but the longer I listened, the more I thought it might be 2 or 3 or as many as 6. They were searching for me, stalking me through the murk, and I didn't dare move. Something in the instinctual part of my brain told me that if I moved, they'd know where I was. It told me to stand as still as I could and not to make a sound as they hunted for me. They searched, they sniffed, but eventually I heard them moving away, and that was when I made my escape. I ran like my life depended on it. And maybe it did. They heard me sooner than I would have thought, and tore off in my general direction. The layout of the parking structure was pretty uniform, and I knew that if I just kept moving in a circle, I could get to the next floor. Something in me screamed that if I could get out of here, that if I could get free of whatever loop I was in, that I could lose the creatures and be done with this madness. Their claws sounded huge as they ate up the ground. They made little huffing noises as they ran, and I couldn't imagine what they might look like. I think I settled on a pack of panthers that had come to get me, and when I suddenly ran into a concrete wall, I just knew they were about to rip me to shreds. It turned out to be for the best, however. As I lay there trying to see if my nose was broken, something hit the wall I had run into with a sound that was loud and angry. It hit it hard enough to send concrete chips cascading over me, and I put a hand over my mouth as I lay completely silent on the dusty concrete. It picked itself up and shook off whatever damage the wall had done to it before snuffling the air soupily. It was looking for me, and I did not want to be found. I could feel its bulk as it came close, smell the rancid meat that must lay beneath those claws, and I hoped that it couldn't hear me trembling. I expected that every breath would be my last, and the thought that I would die as I took shallow half-breaths was depressing. Some indeterminate amount of time later, the creature moved away, and I got up as quietly as I could and tiptoed for the wall. I'd misjudged the circle I was making, and when I found the edge, I headed up the ramp and kept climbing. Something was different now. I could feel it, and when my light-deprived eyes began to adjust to the intrusion of light, I knew I was getting close to the surface. As my hopes came back, I started running again, and that's when I heard them behind me. I came up and saw the crossbar, a little booth that told me the front of the parking deck was in sight. I put on a burst of speed, and when I ducked under the arm, I heard something's claws rake across the wood. I fell onto the asphalt and looked back in time to see a solid black creature with a head like a spade. Its body looked like it was covered in scales instead of fur, and the teeth that hung from that mouth looked painfully big. It had no eyes, but it pointed its spade-shaped head in my direction and seemed to know where I was. Despite the small burn of the moon and the distant islands of the security lights, the creature was still unwilling to come out to get me. It slunk back into the parking structure, and I sighed in relief. I screamed in surprise when I heard footsteps coming towards me, but it was just Carl. He'd been smoking by the parking deck, and when he heard me running out, he came to investigate. I told him about the creature, and he only shrugged like this was just one more thing on this plate. He offered to go get my car for me, and when I asked him if he wasn't afraid of the things down there, he said it was nothing new. Stuff like this happens all the time, he said, and he told me to go wait for him in the front lobby. There's a guy there who I think will want to talk to you. I have a feeling he knows just about what you're talking about. The Mercedes in question came rolling up at that point, and Dr. Long seemed relieved. I finished my notes, but I could feel him staring in much the same way he had described the creature staring at him. So, have you ever heard of anything like this before? Yeah, it's not the first time. If it happens again, just stay in the elevator until it stops. The hospital is like a strange kind of waiting room all its own. Sometimes you slip into places that you aren't prepared for, and it's best to just wait until reality reasserts itself. I don't think I'll be in the parking structure again. I'll take my chances in staff parking. A few dings on the door is a small price to pay for peace of mind. He thanked me before leaving, and I transcribed his notes into the PDF I was keeping for weird things that happened around here. Eventually, we all slip into that strange other room just beyond the waiting room. And if you're lucky, you get to slip back out again, too. Dr. Long was lucky, but he may not get lucky a second time.